All right, kia ora, level 2 bio. So here are the tasks for this week, which is our first week of remote learning. You have 3 tasks to do. You'll have 2 lessons, or 2 tasks with content lessons, and then 1 that's going to be your CPR quiz. Cool. So for today's learning intention, we're going to be looking at test crosses and pedigrees, and using that to help us identify various genotypes. So basically, genetic problem solving is the way I like to describe it as. So for today's success criteria, you should be able to define the term test cross and also explain how it can be used to determine an unknown genotype. You should also be able to use a pedigree chart to be able to determine the probability of a genotype or a phenotype. So this stuff here will mainly be revision from last year. Cool. So the first thing is our consider the following. So take a moment to think what 2 genotypes would result in the same phenotype. And the answer to that question is homozygous dominant and heterozygous. Both of those will result in the dominant phenotype. So if I was a scientist and I was trying to figure out, which genotype did I have? So I have an organism with the dominant phenotype, but I don't know if it's a homozygous dominant or heterozygous. How would I figure that out? The answer is a test cross. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the unknown genotype that has the dominant trait, and I'm going to cross it with a homozygous recessive. And the reason why I'm going to cross it with a homozygous recessive is because for that homozygous recessive, it can only have one genotype, which is the little letters. So let's do some comparison with a test cross. And again, we're thinking about the eye color that we talked about last week. At the top is listed both possibilities for that dominant trait, which was going to be brown eyes. You can be heterozygous or you can be homozygous dominant. I then need to select an individual with the blue eyes, and with blue eyes, there's only one possible genotype, and that's the little e. So let's go in and fill in both of these Punnett squares. So if I was to go down, I would have E and big E and little e and little e. And I might actually just color code it so that way it's easy to tell that that was from the female. And then I pull the father's genotype across. So we're going to do blue. And the only thing that parent can give is the little e's. Cool. Next one, if it's homozygous dominant, we'll pull these big e's down. We'll highlight them in red. You don't need to do this, obviously, when you're doing the assessment. I think it just helps to visualize what's going on. And the little e's get pulled across. Oh, that should be blue. That should be blue. That should be blue as well. Cool. So the main thing that we're seeing then in a difference is that if I have a heterozygous individual, I should have half of my offspring being blue because it's a 50-50 mix. Half of them are heterozygous, half of them are homozygous recessive. If I had a homozygous dominant brown eye person, all the offspring would be brown eyes, and that's because all the offspring are heterozygous. So basically what you're looking for is, in my offspring, do I have at least one individual with the recessive trait? With small sample sizes, obviously you're not going to get that perfect 50-50 ratio, but even in a small sample size, if you get one with that recessive trait, then you definitely have a heterozygous genotype for that dominant trait. Cool. Let's now talk about pedigree. So let's take this one step further. So Punnett squares just show the 2 generations, the parent and the offspring. If we wanted to represent multiple generations, we would be using something called a pedigree chart. And this basically states the relationship between the different organisms and their ancestors. So just to kind of note some of the codes, it's used to show family relationships. The squares refer to males, the circles refer to females. Horizontal lines here mean marriage, and that's kind of like a outdated term. It just means that they had offspring together. The vertical lines are referring to children that are from that crossing. And then if you see a slash through an individual, it means death. So no longer living. And you'll see that with family trees. So I've created an example pedigree chart with the magic gene, because I love Harry Potter. And we're thinking about wizarding families and pureblood wizarding families and half-blood wizarding families and muggle families and mugbloods and all that sort of thing. So in this hypothetical magical gene, we've discovered it on chromosome 13. Now, the non-magic allele is dominant, which is represented by the big M, and the magic allele is represented by the recessive little m. And you do need to write these down, and hopefully you have your notebooks or your booklets of notes with you so you can jot these down. It's mainly just to give you an idea of how this works. So we'll use Harry Potter and his family as an example. So here's his family. James is an only child. He's from Mr. and Mrs. Potter. Lily had one other sibling, Petunia, and she's from Mr. and Mrs. Evans. And what we can see with any pedigree chart is that there's some sort of labeling. So we see that the dark black color is referring to people that are witches or wizards, and the gray color is referring to the muggles. The other thing that I've noted on here is that the witch-wizard trait is the recessive and the muggle trait is the dominant one. But usually, even if they don't label it, you can tell based on how the inheritance patterns look like. Cool. So first thing we see, like I said, those horizontal lines are referring to, in this case, marriage, but it could also just mean that they've bred together. The vertical lines are referring to offspring. And then if I see this kind of branching pattern coming off, it means that those two are siblings. So lots of only children in this family. We can see that in James, Harry, and Dudley. But it's useful that we do have some siblings because then it helps us understand the genotypes more. So first off, let's look at Harry and his parents. So in order to have the recessive trait, you need to be homozygous recessive, so you need to have two little m's. So since Harry is magical, he has two little m's. James would be the same, and Lily would be the same. So the rule goes that if both parents are recessive, the only thing that the offspring can be is also recessive, because they only can give that recessive allele. So that's really easy to kind of go through and label everybody. So same thing when we look at James, and we know he comes from a purebred family. Both his parents are wizards, and so we see little m's there as well. Now let's look at the maternal side, because that one's actually more interesting. So what we see with Lily is that she does have the magical gene, or magical alleles, and she does have the magical trait, but both of her parents did not. Both of her parents were muggles. And so what that tells us is that if an offspring has a recessive trait, both parents need to be heterozygous, because for Lily to get two little m's, she needed to get one from each parent. So both parents must be carriers to give her the ability to do magic. So that's a really good hint whenever you're looking at these pedigree charts. If you see something with a recessive trait, but the parents are both dominant, that tells you that out of the two potential dominant traits, they have to be heterozygous. They cannot be homozygous dominant. If they're homozygous dominant, then the offspring are guaranteed to have at least one dominant allele. And that's the summary of that. So if we look at the other side of the family with Petunia and Vernon, we actually don't know what Petunia is. She does show the dominant muggle trait, but we don't know if that's because she's homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So the only way for us to figure that out would be with a test cross, and she would need a test cross with a wizard. But obviously she didn't do that. Or test cross with a wizard, or look at her offspring. Those are two ways that we could figure it out, because basically we're looking, does she have at least one offspring that has the magical trait? Again, nothing we can tell on the mother or on Petunia's side of the family can give us any hints, because Dudley here is also a muggle and his father is also a muggle, and we don't know, again, because there's nothing from Vernon's side of the family to give us hints to what he might have inherited. So we can assume we don't know actually if he's heterozygous or homozygous dominant. And then same thing with Dudley. So we don't know if he's received 2 big M's, one from each parent, or did he receive 1 big M and 1 little m from each parent? We don't know. We just know that he's a muggle. So, and that's okay when you're doing these pedigree charts. You may not necessarily know what the genotype is because there's not enough information there. And that's how everybody lines up with all of their genotypes. So that's how we can use a pedigree to figure out what everyone is, and it further gets backed up with those test crosses. Cool. Kapai, that is today's lesson. That is the wrong learning intention. Just let me go back and copy that from the beginning, because I did not fix that. But I did fix the bottom bit. That's okay. So today we are looking at how you use a test cross and also the pedigrees, and using both of those as tools to figure out unknown genotypes. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to define what a test cross is, and you should be able to use that to determine an unknown genotype, and you should also be able to use a pedigree chart. This is going to be really important to be able to do, especially when we start looking at multiple genes. Anyway, now it's time for you to move on to your Mahi choice. So if you go onto my Google site, there's a list of potential things you can do to follow up. And all the resources for them are on Google Classroom. Be mindful, you are not expected to complete all of this. It's just to give you some differentiated choice.